Okay. Hi, I'm Raymond. You're watching RPadTV 3000, and my guest today is Jon Radoff, CEO of Beamable. John, how are you doing today?
Awesome. Thank you.
Now, I wanted to have you on because, in all honesty, not kissing up, you are one of the sharpest guys I've met in the video game business, and you're also heavily involved in the metaverse. So, a lot
Mhm.
of it is confusing, and I wanted a very smart person like you to explain the metaverse to maybe someone who is not so smart like me. So, in the most basic sense, John, how would you define the metaverse?
Yeah. Well, first of all, everyone has a different definition for this word metaverse. So if you're confused by it, you're certainly not alone. And there's good reason for that. So you can go all the way back to like Neil Stephenson and what he wrote about in this book called Snow Crash, where he envisioned it as this completely immersive 3D world that you could enter into. You could think of it in terms of the way Ready Player One has done it. You could think of it the way Mark Zuckerberg is.
Right.
But to me, that important part of this idea of the metaverse isn't the technologies or the product features. I think that's actually the mistake people make is they tend to want to say, okay, here's the features of a metaverse. And then they have a whole list of things it needs to do. Some people that means VR, some people that means, a creator economy. So to some people, it's all about blockchain. All of those things have a role within the ongoing development of the metaverse. But here's how I think about it. I think it's about the culture trend leading the technology first, not the other way around. So the culture trend, the way society is evolving, is towards our digital identity, the personas we bring with us into the online space has just become more and more important to us over time. So for many, many people in this world, really billions of people now, our digital identity has become more important even than our physical identity, especially for the last couple of years, for obvious reasons, right? So that culture trend is what actually drives the technology, not the other way around. Because if we didn't have that, the technologies wouldn't be taken up by people. So to me, like the first metaverse was actually Dungeons and Dragons, right?
Right.
So it wasn't digital, but it was a space of imagination where we entered virtual spaces and created worlds and told stories to each other. It was highly creative. And that kind of spawned this whole world of online games, digital games, video games, all the way through online massively multiplayer games. And now this thing we call the metaverse, just to bring it back to like make it concrete for people, it's really just building on that. So think of all this stuff that started with games and created virtual worlds becoming more a part of our society. And now what we're going to start seeing is not only games, which we already have had for quite a while, but all these other game adjacent experiences around music and socialization and all that other stuff is going to start building on top of the same game technology and allowing people to bring their digital identity into these other spaces as well.
I love the Dungeons and Dragons analogy so much. And I think that it solidifies the social aspect, which you said is the more important aspect here. But it seems like so many people are caught up in the technology. And by people, I mean, there's a lot of smart people writing about the metaverse and speaking about the metaverse, but maybe not in ways that make it approachable. How do people involved in creating the metaverse, how can they do a better job communicating what it is and why people should care about it?
Well, if you're an engineer or a nerd like me, like the technology is super interesting. So of course
Yeah.
everybody wants to talk about the technology and debate the relative merits of things or things that they don't want to see in the metaverse. Like some people want to see blockchain
Right.
very much. Some people think it's evil, right? So like these debates are going to be ongoing. So there's a lot of emotion in it, as well as for all of us who just really love products and gadgets and technologies. Like we want to talk about what the future looks like with all of these things. But I think it really just comes down to virtual spaces. a virtual space can exist in the mind. It doesn't even require digital technology, right? Like that's why I use the example of Dungeons and Dragons as a virtual space that people can occupy. The difference between that virtual space and earlier stuff, like say a book, is also a kind of virtual space, but you're the only participant in a book, right?
Right.
There's the author. It's kind of like the telepathy between the author and you across time and space, allowing you to enter that world. But Dungeons and Dragons, that's a multi-person experience. So we're imagining it together. It's a storytelling experience that we are telling together. So I think that's the thing that people can really look at, which is all of these virtual worlds and spaces where it's a shared experience where we're there together. Now, then you can extend that into how does technology help support that? Well, certainly VR, for example, allows us to simultaneously occupy a virtual space and have certain kinds of experiences, these embodied experiences that are difficult to have without something like VR. Right? But VR isn't a requirement of the metaverse. It isn't a requirement of having a shared imaginative or virtual space. It's just a way that really enhances certain kinds of experiences. So of course, like right now, the recent stat that I read is that there's 3 billion gamers in the world. Like it's just a mind-boggling number. So we can start there. Like there's a lot of people who are playing games frequently. Like that 3 billion number, I think, is people who play a game at least once a month. So we already have a lot of people playing games, but then start thinking about how do you take the example of games in terms of the emotional experience of them, the entering of virtual spaces, and start building all this other stuff that isn't necessarily a game, but it uses a lot of game inspiration. So for example, a lot of the things that are happening in Roblox, for example, or VR chat, or all these other examples. They're not all VR, they're not all games, but they're all social, right? So you go to Roblox, that gives you a good predictor of a lot more of what I think we'll see in the quote unquote metaverse, because there's so many experiences in Roblox that could have never been greenlit as games by a commercial game developer. Yet when you make the tools really easy for people to leverage and just make stuff in a virtual space so that all their friends can go into it, you have this explosion of new types of experiences. Some of them are definitely games. Some of them, you kind of scratch your head and wonder, is that really a game? Like, is Adopt Me, for example, a game? There's a lot of other things like that. So I think we're going to start seeing a lot more experiences that are crafted at the micro level, sort of like taking YouTube and what it did for video and taking that to the world of immersive experiences, games, content creation, so that far more people are going to be able to make this stuff, and far more people are going to be able to then enter those creations. So that's what the metaverse is. But if you want to, if the question was what makes this stuff important, what makes it really important is self-expression. Like I think of creativity, self-expression, making stuff. That's one of the most human properties there is. And the metaverse is really about that. It's about giving us this space where we can create things, whether that's a game, whether it's a social experience, whether it's a stage for music or theater, like all of these ways to express ourselves as humans and relate to each other and just really amplify creativity throughout all the cultures of the world. So that's why you ought to care about the metaverse, because it's this amazing stage for self-expression that everybody can participate in.
It sounds like potentially it is a technology that can make the world smaller and more connected in a potentially profound way. But some of what people are writing and saying about the metaverse reminds me of what I was reading and hearing about Second Life like 15, 20 years ago. What is different this time around that will hopefully make the metaverse potentially wonderful in a way that Second Life wasn't able to achieve at that time? And, maybe that's something they still might achieve.
Yeah, so let's not write the obituary of Second Life quite yet, because Second Life is very much alive and
Yes.
well. And so many game developers would love to have something like Second Life where it has endured for, a couple decades and still has an active community there. And as far as I understand, generates pretty significant revenue and profit still. So it's a great business. The question is like Second Life, like what happened? What's the difference over time? I think the Second Life tools were pretty hard to use for like a mass market of people. So if you look at any creator economy, it has to just get really, really easy over time. So you could look at desktop publishing, for example. Like desktop publishing ultimately went away from essentially writing code that would be translated to a printing process. There used to be this language called LaTeX, for example. You'd actually write in code how you'd want things to be printed. Well, desktop publishing took that idea and then turned it into a completely on-screen experience. Okay, Second Life, pretty technical process, fairly cumbersome tools to use. So the creator economy around Second Life really, while it took off for a certain group of people and did some really interesting dynamic stuff there, and particularly early stuff on the internet, it could never really go mass market. So then, Roblox came along. I think in a lot of ways, Roblox took the spirit of things like Second Life, put the creator tools in the hands of people. They realized a few different things. Like it wasn't about having one big world where everyone occupies and has land in it. It's more about let's create experiences, and the experiences we jump into from one to the next. So I think that was a breakthrough in their thinking. It was more YouTube than one massive virtual world. So the structure around it made discovery a lot easier, coupled with some simpler tools, and coupled with as well the thinking around what makes this an experience that kids would enjoy, so that they were appealing more to the next generation of people that were joining the internet. So you can kind of look at the progression from Second Life to Roblox, and then what's next? Well, what's next is how do we make this like a direct from imagination experience as close as we can get? Like if you can dream of it in a virtual world, how do you just put it online? And then it's more like launching a website versus being inside, say, any one particular walled garden. Just put your virtual world, your experience, your game, whatever it is, out there on the internet. So by the way, I think of Second Life as a metaverse. Sometimes people don't like that word used in the singular, but I think you can have a metaverse and you can have the metaverse. The metaverse is really just the internet. Okay, so when we talk about the metaverse, it's just the next generation of the internet. All of these things along the way, like Second Life and Roblox, all the way back to multi-user dungeons, and then even non-digital stuff like Dungeons and Dragons before it, those were all metaverses kind of in the singular. Some people prefer to just call it like a proto-metaverse, or like, the alpha version of what's to come. Like, that's fine. Like, I don't really get hung up on all of those adjectives. I think the metaverse, since it's the internet, can be a really big tent that includes this. I think the properties are immersiveness, real-time action, making creativity a lot easier, and projecting our digital identities through self-expression and connection with other people, central to that, just as that has grown and grown and grown over the last couple of decades now.
I love that you brought up the metaverse versus a metaverse, because that's something that some people get hung up on. Will it work if there are, dozens or hundreds of different metaversi? Does that help it, or does that limit it as something that people will use, or will it help people find individual communities where they can express and create?
Interoperability is important, but we have interoperability at one layer, right? The internet is interoperable. We can connect through a huge, wide array of different applications and things that interconnect with each other already because of the internet. So we do have this basic interoperability that's in place. So I think, first of all, I think people get way too worried about words and adjectives and what to call things. Like that's just going to emerge over time, and people will eventually, call things whatever we're going to call them. I remember when we were calling the internet the information superhighway and cyberspace and all these other terms people don't really use anymore. So the metaverse, I think, is a useful term for capturing these ideas of real-time action, potentially more VR and embodied type stuff, interoperable frameworks between virtual worlds. So I think it kind of captures those notions and those aspirations people have for the internet at this stage. I mean, in terms of like, is it bad to have hundreds of virtual worlds? Well, first of all, I think there will be millions and tens of millions and hundreds of like, look at how many videos are on YouTube, right?
Okay.
Like that's how many virtual worlds there's going to be in the future, and then more than that. So I don't think that's a bad thing, because what we want is to unleash creators to do whatever they want. By the way, it doesn't even have to be 3D. It could just be a 2D experience. It could be 3D. It could be audio only. Like when I go onto these audio platforms like Clubhouse or Twitter Spaces, for example, like that is a virtual space where I'm there in real time with other people. And that to me is the metaverse, right? So these things are going to interconnect with each other. There's going to be certain technologies that allow for things like an avatar to be taken with you from one experience to the next, maybe certain items. This is where a lot of people that are interested in blockchain, see the use cases for blockchain, so that people can have essentially a Switzerland. Switzerland is actually a bad analogy, because that's still a central authority of some kind. Like actually not have to have any central authorities that govern how items and assets and currencies transition between worlds. So I think that that's going to be interesting for a whole bunch of use cases, a lot of social stuff, because we already see that in things like Roblox and VR chat. So we already know people want to do that. I think it'll be interesting to all kinds of creator economies where people are going to build on top of other things and want to have some kind of financial system in which they can be paid for their creative contributions. But I don't think we're going to necessarily see 100% interoperability of all these frameworks, right? Like, I don't think anytime soon you're going to like get an item in World of Warcraft and take it with you into League of Legends, for example, right? Like that's just not going to happen, because not only are the aesthetics completely different from those worlds, what it means to have an item between those different worlds is very, very different. Like I wrote a blog post on this recently about like the different layers of what interoperability can mean. At its most basic level, there's the concept of like interoperability around simply owning things, keeping track of it, keeping track of the persistent worlds and the accounting systems. But then you can kind of build all the way up to things like meaning and what that actually, and what behavior is within certain worlds. So World of Warcraft in that example is not going to be able to dictate what the behavior of an imported item into something like League of Legends is. And even if League allowed the import, they are going to override it with their own rules about what that means. That said, like I think it's going to be more about constellations of interoperability. Like you look at something like VR chat, for example. VR chat, lots of people are building worlds more oriented towards social experience than what we might think of as games. And in the social ecosystem, people are building on top of each other. They're creating links between things. They're creating hyper portals between worlds, and they're allowing avatars to be brought with them. So we already see use cases in the social sphere for that. And there will be different kinds of worlds with different kinds of experiences. Like if I play a 2D graphics game, like my company uses GatherTown to have a social hour every week with our company. Like GatherTown is 2D. It's a completely different aesthetic experience. The way you think about interoperability in that kind of content versus a 3D immersive experience like VR chat versus something that might be photorealistic to something that's more, artsy, cartoony, and a whole other experience, like that'll be different. So there's interesting interoperability things that allow you to take some content and repurpose the look of it across different environments. Like I'm advising a company called Metamundo that's trying to create a marketplace system to allow art to be brought across different ecosystems. But interoperability is a big part of what will happen in the metaverse, just like interoperability is what allowed websites to flourish on the internet.
Now, I'm glad you brought up your blog. I do want to talk about that in a second, but I'm also glad you brought up World of Warcraft. One of my longtime readers has said repeatedly that World of Warcraft is the most successful metaverse ever. Would you agree with that? Does that analogy make sense?
World of Warcraft is a very successful metaverse, if we're going to use that word in the singular again. The most successful, you're up against some pretty big numbers. Like Roblox has 250 million people a month using it, right? Now, the interesting thing with Roblox is sometimes people get confused. They think Roblox is like a world. It's not actually a world. It's more of a platform. It's all the people who have made stuff that become the worlds. So I don't know. That's an interesting question of whether as an individual world was World of Warcraft the biggest. I mean, I don't think it's even as big as League of Legends in terms of total market access. So, I mean, I think your listener is very astute in that they're recognizing that World of Warcraft is a metaverse, that they're kind of thinking of it the way I do. But maybe I would just suggest take the camera lens back a little bit and look at this whole universe of things. Like if you're a gamer, and I'm a gamer, like I love all kinds of games. I love AAA games to free-to-play games on mobile and everything in between. But I find that we gamers sometimes miss sort of what's happening across the broader ecosystem. We look at something like Roblox, for example, and we're like, oh, that kind of doesn't look as good as the kind of games that we're used to, but we're not noticing sort of what's interesting about it. What's interesting about it is not how things look, for example, or even the quality of the gameplay. It's the creativity taking place of it and the social systems that are present there and the projection of identity and the way groups of friends are going from one experience to the next and the cohesion that they have within that environment. So I would say just take a look at those things and what's happening. Maybe you won't be a fan of the kind of content that's available in Roblox right now, but it will start you on this path of imagining what it will mean in the future. And that's sort of as we envision the metaverse as it unfolds. Imagine Roblox, but with any of the graphics you would have wanted and tools that make it even easier. Like it sort of still requires some amount of coding. Like what happens when that becomes more like just art creation and you're sculpting a virtual world as opposed to coding a virtual world. Like these kind of things are going to really change the way we interact with each other and use the internet in the future.
Now, let's talk about building the metaverse, which is a series you've put together on Medium. I find it highly informative and really fascinating. Can you tell the people what they can expect when they read Building the Metaverse?
Well, I'm just really open sourcing my thinking about the metaverse there. So it tends to be the subjects that I'm really interested in, which covers like, what is the metaverse? What are the culture trends? What are the big technology trends as well in terms of like creator tools and artificial intelligence? I talk a lot about game making and the thinking behind game making and how game making has actually gotten a lot harder. Like making the game is getting easier. Making a game that can be commercially successful has gotten a lot harder over time. So I talk about that. I try to talk about the relationship between everything we've learned from game making and how that applies to the metaverse. Because the metaverse is really the future of the internet informed by games, both game design, game socialization, and the game technology stack. All of that stuff is building the metaverse.
Now, I wanted to bring up one of the slides that you used in one of your blog posts, the 9 megatrends shaping the metaverse. I'd like to talk about that middle one, the rise of cybernetics, because that if you look at that alone, it sounds a bit scary, but can you explain to the people that maybe haven't read the post, what do you mean by that?
Well, cybernetics is actually an old word, even though it sounds very science fiction-y. It really just means using tools, really. So Like, it's about bringing the sensory motor systems of us as humans closer to the machines and the things we want to do with them. So, like a computer mouse is an example, an early example of cybernetics. Just looking at a screen is cybernetics. It's the input output systems. But we're going to see these things getting closer and closer to us. So VR, for example, VR still has a long way to go to really have the ergonomics for long-term use, for the mass market to want to use it. Eventually it'll be smart glasses that we put on, and you'll be able to wear it on all day long, and you'll turn it off when you don't want to see any augmentation of the world around you. But like, these things will get better and better. And that's the trend that I see, is towards more and more things that allow us to more directly access these virtual worlds and online information systems and the internet, the metaverse, and the ergonomics of them really improving a lot over the coming decade as things like battery life improves, battery size improves, the compute that you can put on a device improve, the edge computing capacity. All that stuff is going to make these devices a lot more accessible to everybody.
Jon, I want to thank you for your time. I think one of the things that my viewers will find useful is looking at the metaverse, as you said, from a social and a cultural lens instead of a technological one. I think that's something that's getting lost there. And I'm so grateful that you've helped explain that.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I love to talk about this stuff. And if your listeners, your viewers are interested in that stuff, yeah, check out my blog. I have a video series as well that I do, or just follow me on Twitter.
Yes, J
throw my
Radoff.
random thoughts out every day.
Awesome. We'll have you back next time, hopefully, for the next big technological leap. But be sure to check out Jon's Medium blog. Follow Jon on Twitter. And please follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all that good stuff. And join me tomorrow, where we're going in a whole different direction. Not talking about smart stuff. We're going to be talking about Book of Boba Fett. You're watching RPadTV 3000. Thanks so much for watching.